Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the discussion, ANZACS and the Militarisation of Australian Society. Our speakers are David Stiddens, who will be leading off. He's worked extensively on the campaign to prevent the building of additional war memorials in Canberra to rival the Australian War Memorial.
I want to talk in three parts. First of all, ANZAC as it stands at present, ANZAC singular, as it stands at present during the centenary of ANZAC this year and the next 3 years. And I want to introduce a concept called ANZACARY, and I'll come back to that, ANZACARY. Secondly, I want to talk about the militarisation of our society. I'll define militarisation in a particular way. And thirdly, I want to talk about a particular aspect of all this which I think is of concern, and that's the targeting of children in all of this. ANZAC, the bare facts, an invasion of the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago this month. The invaders cling on for about 8 months. There were nearly 9,000 Australians killed and about 18,000 wounded. But of course, a lot of people don't realise those numbers are a very small part of the overall numbers. The Australian forces involved in the Dardanelles campaign were about 5% of the total forces on both sides, and our casualties were also about 5%. What happened next after that? People have read all sorts of things into that Gallipoli adventure. It was the birth of a nation, it was doing our bit for the king and the empire. It was, even to some people, washing away the convict stain and showing that we were true-born free Britons. There was commemoration almost from the beginning. The first memorial to the Dardanelles campaign was built in Adelaide in September 1915. The first commemorative day that was called Anzac Day was actually in October 1915, and the first Anzac Day on the 25th of April was the very following year, 1916. Anzac commemoration in that 100 years has gone up and down. If you want a good book on that, get hold of Carolyn Holbrook's book, Anzac, the Unauthorised Biography. And there were suggestions in that time with this waxing and waning of Anzac that it would not survive, and everyone knows about Alan Seymour, the late now Alan Seymour's play, The One Day of the Year, which was sort of at the very bottom of the story of Anzac. But with this waxing and waning, people identified certain Anzac values, mateship, resourcefulness, courage, etc., which are really universal values, but we've tended to think there's something particularly Australian about those values. And they've been there all the time. And so you've had this sort of commemoration thing, plus these values, and people have kind of lumped that together as this concept of Anzac. And Ken Inglis, as early as 50 years ago, a well-known historian of this field, suggested that Anzac was a secular religion, or sometimes he called it a civic religion. And it's not a bad analogy if you think about it. Anzac is a religious denomination. It's not the established church yet. Like any religion, it's not compulsory. Atheists and agnostics and people of faith can mostly tolerate each other. So the religious analogy I think is helpful, but more recently Christina Toomey at Monash University has written about how Anzac, or military commemoration in general, fits into what she calls a culture of trauma, where people identify with the suffering of people they've never met, where they empathise with people who've suffered, without ever really understanding or bothering to understand the historical events, big events and little events that led to that suffering. And an early example she points to, it's not a military example, was the communal grief over the death of the Princess of Wales 20 years ago, the culture of trauma. I think, though, the template that I've found most useful in looking at what's happened, this increasing interest in Anzac in the last 25 years, is essentially about narcissism. This idea of looking into a mirror, and looking into a mirror particularly to see an image that's larger than yourself. And I think the type of commemoration exercise we engage in nowadays is less about them, the diggers back then, and more about us, about Australians today. And a very perceptive writer called Michael McGurr, writing in 2004, noted how, quote, the remembrance of war is moving from the personal to the public sphere. And he talked about how what had once been a sort of quiet and dignified remembrance of others who hadn't come back from the war had become a sort of private thing, had become noisy. He called it an unrestrained endorsement of ourselves, which in fact devalued the men and women we were trying to revere. He went on to say, people now seem to believe that in looking at the ANZACS, they are looking at themselves. They aren't. The dead deserve more respect than to be used to make ourselves feel larger. Mark McKenna here at Sydney University a few years ago interviewed some backpackers at Gallipoli and asked them why they were there, young people. And they said, it's not about them, the diggers, it's about us, the backpackers. Which I think is a good point to introduce you to the term ANZACkery. If you haven't heard it before, ANZACKERY. And using that term ANZACkery, and I'll tell you in a minute what it means, it's not meant as a gratuitous insult to Anzac Day. Personally, I've got nothing against Anzac Day, provided it's done with dignity. And nor is it meant to insult people who do practice what we called before the secular religion of Anzac. ANZACkery is actually meant to describe the sort of overblown, jingoistic, sentimental commemoration or celebration virtually of Anzac, often with a commercial element built in. And the term was coined about 50 years ago by Geoffrey Searle, who was actually a biographer, among other things, of Sir John Monash. And Searle recalled what he called the fire-breathing generals coming to his primary school in the 1930s to talk about the theme of how Australia had been born at Gallipoli. A couple of quick examples. The first is from Colonel Arthur Burke, who has for many years been with the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee of Queensland. This is what Colonel Burke says. The spirit of Anzac is invincible. It is the flame that burns forevermore in the heart of every true Australian and New Zealander. Today we stand safe and free, clothed with all the privileges and rights of citizens in these great free countries. And all these things, liberty, security, opportunity, the privileges of citizenship, we owe to those men who fought, endured, suffered and died for us and for their country. Their deeds and their sacrifices gave us the invincible, the intangible, the spirit of Anzac. That may be your sort of thing. It may not be. The second example is, actually, see if you can guess who this is. It's a former Prime Minister. Quote, our identity has been etched deeply by what we call Anzac. For nearly a century, Anzac has occupied a sacred place not far from the nation's soul. It shapes deeply our nation's memory. It shapes deeply how we see the world. 100 years later, it shapes too what we do in the world. Neither religious nor secular, whatever our beliefs are, Anzac is profoundly spiritual, inspiring pilgrimages still to that far-off place where our modern-day pilgrims drink deep from the well of national memory. I believe each generation of Australians has a duty to pass this torch to the next. Any guesses as to what Prime Minister might have said that? Howard Hawke, I've heard so far. Keating, no. Kevin Rudd, 2010. He's the champion of ANZACkery among Prime Ministers. I want to talk now about militarisation, the second part of my remarks. It doesn't mean everyone going around in uniform, and I don't think it means a massive conspiracy by the Department of Veterans Affairs to flood schools with books about military things. People will have read that suggestion put in the book, What's Wrong with Anzac. I think they overcooked the argument in that book. DVA, of course, does put out lots of books about military things. A lot of them, we're told by school teachers, get put in the bin, thrown away. Teachers and students are pretty good at sifting and balancing things, but DVA puts out a lot of this stuff. DVA is an example of top-down attempt to put particular views out. But I think we need to consider also there are bottom-up influences meeting that. People are very keen still on family history, and family history of our generation tends to include a military element because people went off to war. Old diggers dying off from the First World War and now the Second War, in quite conspicuous on TV and so on. Backpackers going to Gallipoli, TV shows and so on. It's a bottom-up response, so when DVA or someone puts out particular propaganda, you could call it, it gets an eager response. We talked about 18 months ago to the senior man in charge of commemoration at Department of Veterans Affairs, and we said, what's driving all this, do you reckon? All this stuff that you guys are doing? And it's going to get worse, and that was the end of 2013. And his answer was, it's what the bogans want. He didn't mean the government that had just been elected or the government that had just left power. He meant the people that those governments listen to through focus groups. It's what the bogans want. So having said all that, I want to redefine militarisation. I want to use a slightly old-fashioned word called bellicosity, or belligerence if you like, which is about the inclination to go to war. And I think this is where militarisation works for Australia. Someone described it as the inclination to take part in every war that's going. Iraq 1, Iraq 2, Iraq 3, Afghanistan, Vietnam, going back to that. There's a guy at ANU who looks at reasons for this, Hugh White. And Hugh White talks about a number of reasons. As I said, one of them is the desire to sort of keep in with the Americans and the desire to support the American alliance. But one particular one that I think is important to look at, he reckons that when governments start to rattle the sabre for another military expedition overseas in Australia, they appeal to a solid proportion of the Australian community who accept that such action, going off to wars overseas, is a normal part of who we are. And White argues that that feeling is partly due to what he calls the potent idea of war in Australian society focused on the ANZAC legend. He says, our intense focus on military history, centred on the Gallipoli campaign, has shaped and in some ways distorted both our understanding of Australia's history and our image of ourselves. He goes on, we have come to believe that the experience of combat, fighting overseas, brings out personal qualities which are essential to Australia's national character. So I want to pin militarisation down as that sort of tendency to fight and tendency to think fighting's important. A tendency that some of us think is essential to being Australian in the early 21st century. It's really, and I think the Prime Minister would use this sort of language, it's really saying that a readiness to plunge into war is part of our DNA. And having introduced that genetic thing, I'll move on to the third and final part of what I want to talk about, which is the targeting of children, the next generation. There's one thing you notice with this commemoration material, particularly the ANZACary of it, is how much is directed at children. And I'll give you a few examples. Senator Michael Ronaldson is the Minister for the Centenary of ANZAC. In his speeches he often talks about the obligations, and he uses that word deliberately, we asked his office, the obligations on young Australians to carry forward the torch of remembrance. And Sir Angus Houston, who was, until a couple of years ago, chair of the ANZAC Centenary Advisory Board, which helped the governments decide what they were going to do for the centenary, talks about the need to treat the ANZAC Centenary with the reverence it deserves. He uses the word reverence, remember that religion thing back then, and to carry forward, he calls it the baton of remembrance. Kevin Rudd, if you recall in the extract I read out, the duty to carry the torch. Prime Minister Gillard, on at least one occasion, talked about how great it was to see the number of children at Anzac Day services. There's this official focus on involving children, the next generation. You can see it in institutions as well, like the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where the final room of the new World War I galleries has a big picture, a montage, it sort of scrolls through, of a sort of 1950s ex-World War I digger with his grandson. So the motif is passing the torch from granddad to grandson. The memorial also has a thing called the Commemorative Crosses Project. The idea there is to plant a plywood cross on every single one of the 102,000 graves of Australian servicemen or memorials, if there's no known grave, overseas, 102,000 crosses. And on the crosses, this is the interesting bit, are messages written by school children who go to the memorial and they are coached to write on these little crosses things like, thank you for your sacrifice, you died for our freedom, etc. And the memorial's website has a picture of Brendan Nelson, the director of the memorial, handing these crosses out to children almost like communion wafers. So you can think about whether that's the sort of thing you want your grandchildren or children doing. There are other educational programs at the memorial. Brendan Nelson said the other day to the Senate Estimates Committee, some of these educational programs at the memorial are partly paid for by Lockheed Martin, which is the world's largest arms company. There's also a thing at the memorial called the Discovery Zone, where little kids can fly in a mock-up Iroquois helicopter from the Vietnam War with battle sounds coming over the PA, and they can also dodge a sniper. That's how it's advertised on the War Memorial's website, dodge a sniper in an imitation World War I trench. Then there are the books targeting children. On our website you'll see honesthistory.net.au, flyers going around. We recently reviewed a patriotic little production called ANZAC Ted, which is about a teddy bear that keeps soldiers safe. And the author says the book is aimed at all ages from 3 upwards. And if you're too young to read it yourself, you can have it read to you by Grandad while you cuddle your Army Ted, which is a teddy bear in an army uniform, which you can buy from the War Memorial shop. You can also get Navy Ted and Air Force Ted, $19.95, and snuggle into your camouflage print pyjamas, also available in different sizes from the War Memorial shop. Then there's a book called Audacity. This is the one that really annoys me. A book called Audacity, which is published by the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Memorial, and it's aimed at 10 to 12-year-olds. It's about various war heroes, and the theme essentially is about how being brave wins you medals. It's a book of about 50 pages, and in it there are 17 full-colour pictures of sets of medals that different military heroes have won, as well as classroom exercises along the lines of think of something good in your classroom and design a medal that's appropriate for that. So linking together what happens in war with what happens in the classroom. And another classroom exercise in the booklet is based on a game that pilots in Bomber Command over Europe used to play in World War II. And essentially the game was who could get closest to the bomb target, to the target they were hitting, and take a photo. And there's an exercise in this booklet, Audacity, based on that. And the exercise is illustrated with an aerial photograph of the bombing of Hamburg, in which there were 80,000 civilian casualties, including 42,000 deaths. More than Australians were killed in the whole of World War II. There's no mention of those stats, of course, in the book for the kids. You tend to leave those things out of books for children. Perhaps there should be. And there are lots of other examples. And I suppose the question is, will this have a lasting effect on children? We don't know how many schools use the booklets from DVA, or how many parents buy camouflage pyjamas or army teddy bears, or how firmly the kids who write on these crosses connect with the dead soldiers. The War Memorial's ambition is to have them connect with the dead soldiers. And children, of course, deal with lots of these myths and stories when they're young, the Easter Bunny, virgin birth and all those kind of things. They sift them as they get older. Maybe ANZACS gets sifted out as well. But when you think about it, the pressure on the young is considerable. We always say we don't glorify war, but we spend an awful lot of time commemorating it, and there are always wide-eyed kids in the front row taking it all in. And there's evidence from educators that the first impression lasts, that a sanitised or a glorified view of war as a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old filters the way you see war later on, and you tend to see it through those rose-coloured glasses that you get presented early in your life by ANZAC TED or similar. Just looping back for a moment to that militarisation thing I talked about, and the impact on children of this militarisation. Anna Clark is a historian essentially of the teaching of history, and about 8 years ago she did quite an extensive survey of 15-year-olds, year 9 kids, and she said she was surprised at how many 15-year-olds thought that a militarised national identity was an intrinsic part of being Australian. Back to that point about militarisation. And I want finally to quote Minister Ronaldson again, and I'll quote this exactly because it relates to something I'll say in a moment. He gave a speech last year, July I think, to Sydney Legacy, and he again talked about the responsibility of young Australians to carry the torch of remembrance. Then he went on, quote, "And when they, that's young Australians, hop on a school bus, or they walk home, or they go shopping, or they go out at night with relative freedom, that they realise in many instances that freedom has been paid for in blood. And they must understand that. They must understand that freedom has been paid for in blood." So just hold that thought for a minute, because here's a poem by Osbert Sitwell called The Next War. Not the best known World War I poet, not the best known poem, called The Next War, written in 1919. The poem describes some plutocrats sitting around deciding what would be an appropriate war memorial. And one of them says, and compare this with what Ronaldson just said, one of them says, "What more fitting memorial for the fallen than that their children should fall for the same cause?" Rushing eagerly into the street, the kindly old gentleman cried to the young, "Will you sacrifice through your lethargy what your fathers died to gain? The world must be made safe for the young." And the children went. So I think Sitwell's poem describes the implications of Michael Ronaldson's speech. The implication that freedom paid for in blood may have to be redeemed in similar fashion in the future, which goes back to my definition of militarisation, this building into the culture of a willingness to go to war. So consider whether that's our legacy to future generations, the expectation that honouring the war dead of the past, carrying the torch, requires the preparedness to become the war dead of the future. Thanks.